The rain fell in sheets across the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, turning the powdery terrain into a sticky paste that clung to everything. February 19th, 1945. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone crouched behind a water-cooled machine gun that weighed more than most men could carry, its brass jacket gleaming dully in the pre-dawn darkness. Around him, Marines whispered about the weapon that had made him famous 3 years earlier on Guadalcanal, the same gun that military planners had tried to retire before the war even started, the same gun that theorists called a relic, too heavy for modern mobile warfare, too complex for jungle combat, too slow for the rapid-fire tactics the Pacific Theatre demanded. But Basilone knew what the theorists didn't. He had learned it in the blood-soaked mud of Henderson Field when the screaming began, and wouldn't stop for 3 days. This obsolete weapon from the trenches of France had a secret that would save more American lives than any modern innovation. And it was about to prove itself one final time. The story begins not on a Pacific island, but in a workshop in Utah nearly half a century earlier. John Moses Browning, a self-taught gunsmith with calloused hands and an engineering mind that saw solutions where others saw only problems, hunched over his drafting table in the year 1900. The world's armies were discovering that modern war demanded sustained firepower, the ability to pour bullets into an enemy position not for seconds or minutes, but for hours. The British had their Vickers, the Germans their Maxim-derived Spandau. Both were monsters of steel and complexity, requiring crews of 6 to 8 men and weighing upwards of 140 pounds with their tripods and water systems. Browning looked at these designs and saw inefficiency. His vision was different. The patent filed in 1901 described something revolutionary, masked in simplicity. Where the Maxim guns used complicated, toggle lock mechanisms that required dozens of precisely machined parts, Browning proposed a recoil-operated system with a sliding block that any reasonably skilled machinist could produce. Where European guns required elaborate water circulation systems prone to leaks and failures, Browning designed a jacket that simply held water and let physics do the work. Where other designs demanded constant adjustment and maintenance, Browning's gun was designed to fire until either the ammunition or the water ran out. At just 38 inches long with a 24-inch barrel, the complete weapon weighed only 38 pounds when filled with water. Add the steel tripod and a 250-round cloth belt of 30-06 ammunition, and the total weight came to 93 pounds. Still not light, but nearly 30% lighter than anything comparable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from wherein the world you are watching from today. But lightness wasn't the innovation that mattered. Browning's genius lay in understanding thermal dynamics in a way that would only become obvious decades later, under conditions he could never have imagined. The water jacket surrounding the barrel wasn't just cooling, it was thermal mass. Every round fired generated approximately 1,800 foot-pounds of energy, most of which converted to heat in the barrel. In a conventional air-cooled weapon, this heat had to dissipate through convection, air flowing across metal surfaces. The process worked, but it depended entirely on environmental conditions. Cold air moved heat faster than warm air. Dry air cooled better than humid air. At 90 degrees Fahrenheit with 90% humidity, the kind of conditions common across the South Pacific, air cooling lost approximately 40% of its effectiveness compared to temperate climates. Browning's water jacket changed the equation entirely. Water has a specific heat capacity 4 times higher than steel and over 3,000 times higher than air. 1 gallon of water, roughly the capacity of the M1917A1's jacket, could absorb the heat from approximately 2,000 rounds before reaching its boiling point. And even then, the system kept working. As water converted to steam, it carried heat energy away from the barrel through the steam port, venting into the atmosphere. The phase change from liquid to vapor absorbed enormous amounts of energy, 539 calories per gram at sea level, creating a continuous cooling cycle that functioned regardless of ambient temperature or humidity. The gun could fire essentially forever, limited only by ammunition supply and mechanical wear, not by thermal buildup. None of this seemed to matter in 1917 when the United States entered the Great War. The American Expeditionary Forces needed machine guns immediately, and Browning's design was still relatively unknown. The military ordered thousands of French Hotchkiss and British Vickers guns to equip the rapidly expanding army. Browning's prototype sat in trials at Springfield Armory, performing admirably but arriving too late to matter. By the time production ramped up in late 1917, Colt Firearms and other contractors were churning out the new M1000 917 Browning machine gun at impressive rates. Nearly 31,000 were manufactured before the armistice in November 1918, but only about 1,200 saw actual combat in France, arriving in the final 2.5 months of the war. The 6th Machine Gun Battalion, 4th Brigade, 2nd Marine Division didn't even receive their Brownings until November 14th, 3 days after the fighting stopped. The interwar years were not kind to the M1000 917. Military planners, studying the lessons of the Great War, concluded that future conflicts would emphasize mobility and rapid maneuver. The weight that made the guns so stable in static trench warfare became its primary liability in theories of mobile combat. At 93 pounds combat ready, the weapon required multiple men to move effectively. Its tripod legs caught on vegetation. Its water jacket could freeze in winter or run dry in summer. The fabric ammunition belts absorbed moisture and swelled. Everything about the gun seemed designed for yesterday's war, not tomorrow's battlefield. Between 1918 and 1936, most M1000 917 machine guns sat in military warehouses, slowly gathering dust, while newer designs captured the attention of military procurement officers. Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois, one of the Army's primary weapons facilities, received orders in 1936 to modernize the obsolete M1000 917 inventory. The engineers made numerous small improvements. They strengthened the feed pawl pivot arm so the gun could handle longer ammunition belts pulled from ground level. They developed an all-steel water jacket to replace the earlier brass-capped version, stronger and more resistant to damage. They improved the top cover hinge with a positive locking pin that prevented it from dropping closed on gunners' hands during maintenance. They updated the rear sight to accommodate both the new M1 ball ammunition with its 172-grain boat-tail bullet and the older M1906 150-grain flat-base rounds. These changes were significant enough to warrant a new designation. The updated weapon became the M1917A1. But it was still fundamentally the same gun John Browning had designed 4 decades earlier. The real competition came from within Browning's own designs. During the First World War, the Army had requested an air-cooled version of the M1000 917 for use in tanks and aircraft where water supplies were impractical. Browning responded with the M1000 919, which removed the water jacket entirely and replaced it with a perforated barrel sleeve that allowed air circulation. The weight dropped from 93 pounds to 41 pounds. The gun could be carried by one man instead of requiring a crew. It fired the same .30-06 cartridge at similar velocities. On paper, it was superior in almost every measurable way except one: sustained fire capability. But that difference seemed academic in peacetime exercises, where engagements were carefully timed and ammunition was expensive. By 1941, when Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor thrust America into another world war, the M1000 919 had become the standard infantry machine gun for most Army and Marine units. The M1917A1 was relegated to training roles, coastal defense, and reserve units. Young Marines like John Basilone, who had served in the Army in the Philippines during the late 1930s, learned their machine gun craft on the older weapon simply because that's what was available in garrison. But when Basilone and thousands of other Marines prepared to deploy to the Pacific theater in early 1942, military doctrine called for the lighter, more modern M1000 919 to equip frontline combat units. The water-cooled gun was yesterday's technology, a museum piece that would only slow down mobile forces operating in dense jungle terrain. The first hint that doctrine might be wrong came not from combat, but from training. In the summer of 1942, Marine units preparing for deployment to the Pacific conducted intensive live fire exercises in the swamps of North Carolina and the humid coastline of California. These exercises attempted to replicate the environmental conditions troops would face in the Solomon Islands. Temperatures exceeded 90 degrees. Humidity hovered near saturation. The air hung thick and still, with barely enough breeze to stir the palm fronds. During extended firing drills designed to simulate defensive engagements against mass attacks, something unexpected happened. The M-1919 machine guns, firing at their theoretical cyclic rate of 800 to 1,000 rounds per minute, began overheating within 2 to 3 minutes of sustained fire. Barrels glowed cherry red through their perforated sleeves. Gunners reported that the weapons were too hot to touch, even with asbestos gloves. Firing had to cease for cooling periods of 5 to 10 minutes. Some barrels warped from the heat, rendering the weapons inaccurate or inoperable. Meanwhile, the M1917A1 guns used in the same exercises maintained steady fire for the entire duration of the drills. Their water jackets absorbed heat without visible distress. Steam vented from the top ports, creating small clouds above each gun position, but the weapons themselves remained functional. Gunners could cycle through multiple 250-round belts without pausing. The brass water jackets grew warm to the touch, but never hot enough to cause burns. After 30 minutes of continuous fire, an M1919 would typically have fired between 800 and 1,200 effective rounds before being forced to cease for cooling. An M1917A1 would have fired 3,000 rounds without interruption. The difference was academic in peacetime. It would become critical in combat. Captain Roy Smith, of the 1st Marine Division, watched these training exercises with growing concern. He commanded a company scheduled to deploy to Guadalcanal within weeks, and his unit had been issued a mix of both weapon types. The M1919S were supposed to be his primary machine guns, portable enough for advancing troops. The M1917A1S were backup weapons, intended for fixed defensive positions where their weight wouldn't matter. But the training results troubled him. In every exercise that simulated the kind of human wave attacks intelligence reports suggested the Japanese favored, the air-cooled guns failed at exactly the moment when continuous fire became most critical. Smith wasn't alone in his concerns, but changing official doctrine in the middle of a war, mobilization was nearly impossible. His reports went to battalion headquarters where they were noted and filed. The M1919 remained the primary weapon. The M1917A1 remained an obsolete backup. The 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942. The initial assault met surprisingly light resistance. The Japanese garrison, caught off guard by the speed of the American attack, fled into the jungle, leaving behind their partially completed airfield. The Marines secured the position within hours and immediately began fortifying the perimeter. The airfield, renamed Henderson Field in honor of a Marine aviator killed at Midway, became the strategic center of the entire campaign. Control of that airfield meant control of the air over the Solomon Islands. Control of the air meant control of the sea lanes between America and Australia. The Japanese understood this as clearly as the Americans did. They would spend the next 6 months trying to take Henderson, Field back, and the Marines would spend 6 months stopping them. Sergeant John Basilone arrived on Guadalcanal with D Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment, on September 18th. He was 25 years old, heavily built with broad shoulders and calloused hands that revealed years of manual labor. His face carried the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his adult life outdoors. Born in Buffalo, New York, the 6th of 10 children in an Italian immigrant family, Basilone had dropped out of school at 15 to work as a golf caddy during the Depression. He'd enlisted in the Army in 1934 at age 17, served 3 years in the Philippines, where he became a champion boxer known as Manila John, then returned to civilian life as a truck driver in Maryland. Civilian life hadn't agreed with him. He enlisted in the Marines in July 1940, underwent training at Paris Island, Quantico, and New River, and quickly established himself as one of the Corps' most skilled machine gunners. His expertise came from those army years in the Philippines. The garrison at Manila had been equipped with M1917 water-cooled guns, and Basilone had spent countless hours learning every aspect of their operation. He could field-strip the weapon blindfolded, identify malfunctions by sound, clear jams while under fire, and maintain the complex water-cooling system in tropical conditions. This knowledge was rare in the Marine Corps by 1942. Most young Marines trained exclusively on the newer M1919 and had barely seen an M1917A1. Basilone's experience made him valuable in ways the Corps was only beginning to understand. When his battalion was ordered to establish defensive positions around Henderson Field, Basilone found himself assigned to command 2 machine gun sections equipped not with the modern M1919S, but with 4 of the old M1917A1 water-cooled guns. The defensive line his sections occupied sat approximately 1,000 yards south of Henderson Field, on a jungle-covered ridge that overlooked a narrow ravine leading north toward the airstrip. Japanese forces controlled most of the island beyond this thin defensive perimeter. Every night, Marine sentries could hear the sounds of enemy movement in the jungle, voices speaking Japanese, the clink of equipment, the shuffling of many feet through undergrowth. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were massing forces for a major attack, possibly 3,000 to 4,000 troops concentrated for a coordinated assault on multiple positions. The goal was simple: break through the Marine lines, overrun Henderson Field, and regain control of the airstrip. If they succeeded, the entire American position on Guadalcanal would become untenable. Basilone spent October 23 preparing his positions with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that small details determined survival. Each M1917A1 was sighted to cover overlapping fields of fire, creating interlocking zones where enemy troops would be exposed to multiple weapons simultaneously. He marked range cards with white painted stakes that remained visible even in darkness, allowing gunners to traverse their weapons accurately without being able to see targets. He stockpiled ammunition, linking 250-round belts together to create longer, continuous feeds that would eliminate reloading delays during critical moments. He filled every available container with water for the cooling jackets, understanding that resupply during combat would be difficult or impossible. He trained his gunners on clearance drills, the procedures for dealing with jams and malfunctions that inevitably occurred during sustained fire. Most critically, he walked each man through the thermal characteristics of their weapons, explaining what the steam venting meant, how to monitor water levels, and how to recognize the early signs of cooling system failure. The attack began just fit. After 10 o'clock on the night of October 24th, the Japanese came without preliminary bombardment, simply materializing from the jungle darkness in waves of screaming infantry. Basilone's position, located at a key choke point where terrain funneled attacking forces into a narrow corridor, immediately became the focus of intense enemy pressure. The distinctive sound of banzai charges, hundreds of voices screaming in unison, rose above the hammer of machine gun fire. Japanese soldiers threw themselves at the Marine positions with fanatical determination, climbing over barbed wire barriers on the bodies of fallen comrades, hurling grenades, firing rifles from point-blank range. The intensity exceeded anything Basilone had experienced in training or imagined in planning. His M1917A1 settled into its rhythm immediately, 600 rounds per minute, steady and unfaltering. The gun's recoil-operated action cycled with mechanical precision, each spent casing ejecting and each fresh round chambering in perfect sequence. Basilone fed belt after belt into the weapon's action, his movements smooth from thousands of hours of practice. The water jacket grew warm, then hot, then began venting steam in visible plumes that rose into the night air, but the gun kept firing. Japanese soldiers fell in clusters as the intersecting fire patterns caught them from multiple angles. Bodies piled up in the killing zone until they formed barriers that subsequent waves had to climb over. Still, the attack continued, fresh troops replacing casualties, maintaining forward pressure through sheer weight of numbers. 20 minutes into the engagement, one of Basilone's 4 guns fell silent. A direct hit from a Japanese grenade had killed 2 gunners and damaged the weapon's feed mechanism. Basilone immediately recognized the sound of the gun stopping, a gap in the defensive fire pattern that the Japanese would exploit within seconds. He sprinted approximately 90 pounds of weapon, components and ammunition across 200 yards of open ground under direct enemy fire, carrying a complete spare gun to replace the damaged weapon. Japanese soldiers shot at him as he ran. He killed several with his Colt .45 pistol at ranges of less than 10 yards. He reached the gun pit, installed the replacement weapon, and had it firing again within minutes. The gap in defensive fire closed before the Japanese could pour through it. The water cooling system that military theorists had dismissed as obsolete complexity was performing exactly as John Browning had designed it 40 years earlier. Each M1917 A1 was firing continuously for periods exceeding 20 minutes without pause, something no air-cooled weapon could sustain in the humid heat of Guadalcanal. The thermal mass of the water jacket absorbed tens of thousands of foot-pounds of energy that would have melted an air-cooled barrel within minutes. The phase change from water to steam carried heat away faster than the firing could generate it. The guns that were supposed to be too heavy, too complex, too slow for modern warfare, were proving to be the only weapons capable of stopping a determined Japanese assault. By midnight, ammunition was running critically low. The 250-round belts Basilone had carefully stockpiled were being consumed faster than resupply could replace them. The supply lines from the rear had been cut by Japanese infiltrators who had broken through weaker sections of the marine perimeter. Basilone's guns had perhaps 50 to 75 rounds remaining per weapon, enough for less than 10 seconds of firing at their sustained rate. Without ammunition, the guns would fall silent. Without fire to keep them at bay, the Japanese would overrun the positions. Basilone made a decision that would define his legend. He would go get more ammunition himself, on foot, through enemy-held jungle, carrying as many belts as he could manage back to his guns. He moved through the darkness like a predator, using every skill learned in years of jungle training. His .45 pistol and his Ka-Bar knife were the only weapons he carried, leaving his hands free for ammunition belts. He crawled through underbrush within yards of Japanese positions, listening to enemy soldiers calling to each other in the darkness. He found an ammunition supply point approximately 150 yards behind the main line, loaded himself with belts until he could barely move, then made the return journey with over 90 pounds of linked cartridges draped across his shoulders and torso. Japanese soldiers spotted him twice. Both times he killed them silently with his knife, their bodies falling into the undergrowth without raising alarm. He reached his gun positions and distributed the ammunition just as the last belts were running out. The guns resumed firing without missing more than a few seconds. The engagement continued through the entire night and into the morning of October 25th. Basilone moved constantly between his 4 gun positions, clearing jams, adjusting fields of fire, replacing gunners who were killed or wounded, and maintaining the water cooling systems. At one point, his asbestos barrel-changing glove was lost in the darkness. When a gun's barrel needed changing due to wear rather than heat, he grabbed the searing metal with his bare hands, sustaining third-degree burns on his palms and forearms. He made the change, brought the gun back into action, and continued fighting without pause for medical attention. Private First Class Nash Phillips, who survived the battle despite losing a hand, later recalled seeing Basilone during a brief lull. He was barefoot, his boots having been torn off by the volcanic mud. His eyes were bloodshot from smoke and lack of sleep. His face was black with gunpowder residue. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing burned forearms. He had a .45 pistol tucked into his waistband and moved, with the mechanical efficiency of someone past exhaustion operating on pure will. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese assault had collapsed. The regiment that had attacked Basilone's position, approximately 3,000 men, had been virtually annihilated. Bodies were stacked so high in front of his gun positions that they blocked the weapons' fields of fire. Basilone had to send Marines forward to physically push the corpses aside so the guns could continue covering their sectors. Of his 16-man machine gun sections, only Basilone and 2 others had survived unwounded. The 4 M1917A1 guns had fired an estimated 4,000 rounds each, 16,000 rounds total, without a single weapon failure attributable to overheating. If those positions had been equipped with M1919 air-cooled guns as standard doctrine prescribed, they would have failed within the first 30 minutes of fighting. The Japanese breakthrough would have been inevitable. Henderson Field would have fallen. The entire Guadalcanal campaign might have ended differently. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, Basilone's commanding officer and one of the most respected combat leaders in Marine Corps history, walked the defensive positions that morning, counting casualties and assessing damage. When he reached Basilone's section and saw the nearly 900 Japanese dead stacked in front of 4 machine gun positions, he understood immediately what had happened. The weapons everyone had written off as obsolete had just won one of the most critical defensive actions of the Pacific War. Puller recommended Basilone for the Medal of Honor on the spot. The recommendation would be approved, making Basilone the first enlisted Marine to receive America's highest decoration during World War II. But more importantly, for the thousands of Marines who would fight in the Pacific over the next 3 years, Puller also sent an urgent message to division headquarters requesting immediate redistribution of M1917A1 machine guns to all frontline units. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation of perception began within hours of the battle for Henderson Field. Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, received Captain Roy Smith's after-action reports with the kind of attention that only comes from desperate circumstances. The numbers told a story that contradicted every assumption military planners had made about modern machine gun doctrine. Smith's M1917A1 equipped positions had maintained an average uptime of 96% during sustained engagements lasting multiple hours. Comparable positions armed with M1919 air-cooled guns reported uptime of only 72%, with forced cooling periods creating dangerous gaps in defensive fire. The difference translated directly to casualties. Units defending with water-cooled guns suffered approximately 40% fewer losses than units with air-cooled weapons in similar tactical situations. The technical analysis went deeper than simple ammunition counts. Marine engineers conducted detailed thermal studies of both weapon systems under actual combat conditions, measuring barrel temperatures and calculating heat dissipation rates in the oppressive environment of Guadalcanal. The data confirmed what Basilone and other experienced gunners had discovered through brutal trial. At ambient temperatures of 90 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity levels near saturation, the M1919's air cooling capacity dropped catastrophically. The weapon could fire perhaps 1,200 rounds in short bursts before thermal buildup forced a cooling pause of 5 to 10 minutes. The M1917A1, by contrast, could fire continuously until its ammunition was exhausted or its water supply ran dry. In practice, this meant the older weapon could deliver 3 to 4 times more effective fire during the critical minutes when Japanese assault waves were at their most dangerous. The logistical implications rippled through the entire supply chain. Ordnance officers who had been systematically retiring M1917A1 guns to rear echelon duties suddenly found themselves scrambling to locate stored weapons and ship them forward to combat units. Rock Island Arsenal, which had modified the original M1917 guns into the improved A1 version during the late 1930s, ramped up refurbishment operations. Weapons that had been gathering dust in stateside warehouses for years were inspected, repaired, and placed on fast transport ships to the Pacific. Between October and December 1942, the number of M1917A1 guns in frontline Marine battalions increased from approximately 20% to over 60% of total machine gun inventory. The weapon that had been considered obsolete 6 months earlier had become the most requested item in the Pacific. Theater supply system. Training protocols underwent complete revision. The Marine Corps established specialized schools for M1917A1 operation, pulling experienced gunners like Basilone's surviving squad members back to training centers where they could pass their combat-learned knowledge to newly arrived troops. The curriculum emphasized environmental factors that peacetime training had never addressed, how humidity affected water evaporation rates and required more frequent jacket refilling than temperate climates, how the porous volcanic soil of Pacific Islands made ground-level ammunition feeding more difficult, requiring higher mounting of ammunition boxes, how tropical vegetation created different fields of fire than the open terrain most gunners had trained in, how the distinctive sound signature of the water-cooled gun, a lower-pitched steady hammering rather than the sharp bark of air-cooled weapons, affected enemy tactical responses. The psychological dimension proved as significant as the technical advantages. Japanese commanders began adapting their assault tactics specifically to counter American machine gun fire. They had learned to listen for the distinctive 8-round clip ejection sound of the M1 Garand rifle, timing their final rushes to coincide with reloading cycles when defensive fire slackened. They had learned to recognize the thermal limitations of air-cooled machine guns, using probing attacks to force American gunners to expend ammunition and heat their barrels, then launching main assaults during the cooling pauses. The M1917A1 eliminated these tactical exploitations. Its continuous fire capability meant there was no predictable pause for reloading or cooling that Japanese troops could exploit. The weapon's belt-fed system could be topped off during lulls, without requiring the gun to cease firing entirely. Basilone had demonstrated this technique during the Henderson Field battle, firing 3 rounds, then loading 2 fresh rounds into the belt, maintaining continuous fire while ensuring his weapons never ran completely empty during critical moments. Enemy intelligence reports captured later in the war revealed how Japanese troops perceived the water-cooled guns. They called them thunder guns, or steam devils, describing them with a mixture of fear and respect that air-cooled weapons never inspired. The visible steam venting from the water jackets during sustained fire created an intimidating visual effect that added to the weapon's psychological impact. The steady, unrelenting nature of the fire pattern conveyed an impression of mechanical inevitability that human wave tactics were psychologically designed to overwhelm. When the waves broke against fire that never slackened, never paused, never gave any sign of stopping, the psychological effect on attacking troops was devastating. Multiple prisoners reported that entire companies had lost cohesion and fled after facing M1917A1 fire for more than a few minutes. The tactical renaissance of the water-cooled gun extended far beyond Henderson Field. 2 days after Basilone's action, on October 26th, Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Page commanded another M1917A1 section, defending a different portion of the Lunga perimeter. Page, a 24-year-old from Pennsylvania who had enlisted in the Marines at 18, found himself in command of 33 Marines, manning 4 machine guns along a ridge overlooking a jungle-covered ravine. He had rigged tripwires with C-ration cans containing empty cartridges, a makeshift early warning system that would rattle if disturbed by approaching troops. Just after 3 in the morning, the cans began rattling. A Japanese regiment, over 2,000 men, emerged from the jungle and began their assault. The attack hit Page's position with overwhelming force. Japanese artillery from across the Matanikau River pounded the ridge with shells that killed or wounded Marines in the first minutes of combat. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted as enemy infantry closed to grenade range. A Japanese soldier thrust his bayonet at Page's head. The sergeant blocked with his left hand, sustaining a deep cut that nearly severed his fingers, then killed his attacker with his car-bar knife. The 2 rifle companies positioned behind Page's machine gun platoon withdrew under pressure, isolating his gunners and exposing them to attacks from multiple directions. Within the first hour, all 32 of Page's Marines had been killed or wounded. He was alone with 4 M1917A1 1 machine guns, and an enemy regiment trying to break through to Henderson Field. Page did something that would seem impossible if not for multiple eyewitness accounts and his Medal of Honor citation. He operated all 4 guns himself, moving from position to position, firing each weapon until its ammunition ran low, then rotating to the next. The M1917, a one's design, made this barely feasible. The water-cooled system meant he didn't have to wait for barrels to cool between firing sequences. The belt-fed system meant he could top off ammunition during brief pauses, rather than reloading from empty. The weapon's mechanical simplicity meant even a lone operator could maintain it under combat stress. Page fired, moved, fired again, maintaining a rate of fire that convinced the Japanese they were facing a fully manned defensive line rather than a single Marine. His wounds bled freely but didn't incapacitate. His ammunition dwindled but never ran completely out. The guns kept firing. Reinforcements arrived just before dawn, Army troops from the 164th Infantry Regiment who had been rushed forward when the Japanese breakthrough became apparent. Page immediately organized them into a counterattack, leading a bayonet charge that drove the Japanese back down the ridge and prevented the breakthrough. His solitary defense had temporarily stalled. By the time the sun rose, over 1,000 Japanese soldiers lay, dead in front of his positions. 4 water-cooled machine guns had stopped an entire regiment. Page received the Medal of Honor, the second awarded for the Battle of Henderson Field. Like Basilone, he specifically credited the M1917A1's sustained fire capability in his after-action reports. Like Basilone, he became a vocal advocate for the weapon's deployment throughout the Pacific Theater. The vindication of the M1917A1 accelerated through November and December of 1942 as the battle for Guadalcanal entered its most desperate phase. Japanese General Harukichi Hyakutake committed his entire 17th Army to retaking Henderson Field, throwing regiment after regiment against the Marine defensive perimeter in coordinated night attacks designed to overwhelm American positions through sheer weight of numbers. The pattern repeated itself with brutal consistency. Japanese troops would mass in the jungle darkness, their officers whipping them into the psychological state necessary for banzai charges, then launch themselves at Marine lines in human waves that seemed unstoppable. And time after time, they broke against the steady hammering of water-cooled machine guns that never overheated, never paused for more than the seconds required to load fresh ammunition belts, never gave the attackers the gaps they needed to break through. Staff Sergeant William Fournier commanded an M1917, a 1 section during the November offensive, positioned along a stretch of the Matanikau River where terrain created a natural funnel for Japanese attacks. His after-action report provided technical details that would influence Marine Corps doctrine for years to come. Fournier's guns fired continuously for 7 hours and 40 minutes during the night of November 13th through 14th, consuming over 28,000 rounds of .30-06 ammunition. The water jackets required refilling twice during this period, accomplished by carrying water forward from a nearby stream under sporadic enemy fire. 3 separate ammunition resupply runs were necessary to maintain the firing rate, but most significantly, the guns themselves never malfunctioned due to thermal stress. When Marine armourers inspected the weapons after the engagement, they found normal wear consistent with the round count, but no heat damage to barrels, no warping of internal components, no degradation of the water cooling system. The guns were refilled with water and ammunition and returned to service within hours. The contrast with air-cooled weapons remained stark and damning. Lieutenant Robert Leckie, serving with H Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, recorded his experiences with both weapon types in a memoir that would later become famous. Leckie's squad initially carried M1919 air-cooled guns during the early phases of the Guadalcanal campaign. He described the frustration of watching barrels glow red in the darkness during firefights, forcing gunners to cease fire, precisely when enemy pressure was greatest. The cooling pauses lasted anywhere from 4 to 12 minutes depending on how hot the barrel had become, creating gaps in defensive coverage that Japanese troops learned to exploit. After his unit transitioned to M1917A1 guns in late October, Leckie noted the psychological difference for both Marines and their enemies. American troops gained confidence from knowing their firepower was reliable and continuous. Japanese attackers showed visible hesitation when facing the distinctive sound and unceasing fire of water-cooled weapons. The technical superiority became so obvious that some Marine units began informal competitions to see which machine gun sections could maintain the longest continuous fire without mechanical failure. Gunnery Sergeant Anthony Casamento's section set what may have been the record during fighting in early December, maintaining continuous fire for 9 hours and 17 minutes while defending a supply dump near Henderson Field. His guns fired approximately 34,000 rounds during this period, depleting the entire ammunition reserve for his company and requiring emergency resupply by jeep from regimental stores. The water jackets were refilled 4 times, using a combination of stream water, well water, and, in desperate moments, water from Marine canteens. Post-engagement inspection showed the guns had functioned flawlessly throughout. Casamento would later receive the Medal of Honor for a different action during the Cape Gloucester campaign, but he always maintained that his section's performance that December night demonstrated the true value of John Browning's 40-year-old design. The logistical challenges of supporting widespread M1917, a one deployment, were substantial but proved manageable with proper planning. Each gun required approximately 1 gallon of water for its cooling jacket, plus additional water for refills during extended engagements. In the dense jungles of Guadalcanal, water was generally available from streams and springs, though it often required filtering or boiling to remove sediment that could clog the cooling system. Ammunition consumption rates averaged 1,500 to 2,000 rounds per gun per major engagement, significantly higher than the 800 to 1,000 rounds typical for M1919 equipped positions. But the improved effectiveness more than justified the increased supply burden. Casualty analyses showed that M1917 A1 positions achieved approximately 3 to 4 enemy casualties per belt of ammunition expended, compared to roughly 2 casualties per belt for air-cooled positions. The water-cooled guns were literally twice as efficient at converting ammunition into enemy dead. The weight disadvantage that had seemed so crippling in peacetime planning turned out to be largely irrelevant in actual Pacific combat conditions. The nature of jungle warfare meant that defensive positions were typically held for days or weeks rather than hours. Once a machine gun was manhandled into position, emplaced properly with good fields of fire, and supplied with adequate ammunition and water, it didn't need to move. The 93-pound combat weight became an asset rather than a liability. The substantial tripod provided a stable firing platform that improved accuracy at extended ranges. The massive water jacket helped absorb recoil, allowing more precise control during sustained fire. The overall mass of the weapon system made it resistant to displacement from Japanese artillery near misses that could knock lighter weapons out of position. What military theorists had seen as excessive weight, combat Marines recognized as battlefield stability. Training innovations continued evolving as more units gained combat experience with the weapon. Master Sergeant Lewis Hall developed techniques for rapid barrel changes that reduced the process from the standard 3 to 4 minutes down to under 90 seconds. His method involved pre-positioning spare barrels near each gun pit with the headspace already gauged and adjusted, eliminating the time-consuming adjustment procedures normally required after barrel installation. Though barrel changes were rarely necessary with water-cooled guns due to their superior thermal management, Hall's techniques proved valuable in situations where barrels were damaged by enemy fire or worn out from extremely high round counts. His training manual became standard throughout the Pacific Fleet Marine Force. The psychological impact on Japanese tactical planning became increasingly apparent as captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed enemy adaptations. Japanese commanders began specifically requesting information about American machine gun types before planning attacks. Units that reported facing steam guns or thunder guns were allocated more artillery support and given permission to abort attacks if initial waves failed to create breakthroughs. Some Japanese officers recommended avoiding night attacks entirely against positions known to be defended by M1917, A1 guns, arguing that the continuous fire capability negated the traditional advantages of darkness and surprise that made banzai charges effective. This reluctance represented a significant shift in Japanese tactics, which had previously treated human wave attacks as virtually unstoppable if executed with sufficient fanatical determination. By February 1943, when organized Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal finally collapsed and the surviving enemy troops evacuated the island, the M1917A1 had become firmly established as the primary defensive machine gun for Marine Corps infantry battalions. The standard table of organization called for 24 water-cooled guns in each battalion weapons company, with air-cooled M1919S relegated to secondary roles in rifle companies, where their lighter weight provided advantages for patrol and offensive operations. This distribution recognized that each weapon type had specific tactical applications where its characteristics were optimal. The M1917A1 dominated defensive engagements and sustained fire missions. The M1919 remained superior for mobile operations and situations where rapid displacement was necessary. Rather than choosing one weapon over the other, the Marine Corps learned to employ both types according to mission requirements. The lessons of Guadalcanal spread rapidly through the Pacific theater as veteran units rotated back to rear areas and shared their experiences with newly arriving Marines. John Basilone became the most visible symbol of this knowledge transfer. In May 1943, he received the Medal of Honor during a ceremony in Australia attended by General Vandergrift and other senior commanders. The citation specifically mentioned his actions manning and supplying machine guns during the critical defense of Henderson Field. Basilone was immediately ordered back to the United States for a war bond tour, leveraging his heroic image to encourage civilian support for the war effort. He traveled across the country through the summer and fall of 1943, appearing at rallies, meeting with political leaders, and helping to sell millions of dollars worth of war bonds. Movie studios offered him contracts. He could have spent the entire war safely stateside, famous and comfortable. But Basilone grew restless with the celebrity role. He understood something that rear echelon planners and civilian populations could not fully grasp. The M1917A1's tactical advantages meant little without skilled operators who understood the weapon's capabilities and limitations under combat conditions. Training schools could teach the mechanical procedures for operating the gun, but they could not replicate the experience of maintaining sustained fire while enemy soldiers were dying 10 yards from your position, while grenades were exploding around your gun pit, while your friends were being killed beside you. That knowledge existed only in the minds of combat veterans, and it needed to be passed directly to the Marines who would face similar situations in future battles. After months of war bond appearances, Basilone formally requested return to combat duty. His request was denied multiple times. He was too valuable as a symbol, too important for morale efforts. He persisted until the Marine Corps finally relented. In December 1943, Gunnery Sergeant Basilone returned to Camp Pendleton in California to serve as an instructor in the newly formed machine gun school. The training program Basilone helped develop represented a revolutionary approach to teaching weapons employment. Rather than focusing primarily on mechanical operation and maintenance, the curriculum emphasized combat decision-making under stress. Students learned to recognize the signs of enemy massing for attack, to adjust fields of fire based on terrain and vegetation, to prioritize targets during human wave assaults, to maintain water cooling systems with limited resources, to clear malfunctions while under direct fire, and most critically, to push through the physical and psychological exhaustion that came from hours of continuous combat. Basilone taught through demonstration and repetition, running students through scenario after scenario until their responses became instinctive. He was particularly insistent on night training, arguing that most Japanese attacks came in darkness and Marines needed to be able to operate their weapons by feel when vision was impossible. The broader strategic situation in the Pacific evolved rapidly through 1943 and early 1944. American forces advanced through the Solomon Islands, captured the Marshall Islands, and prepared for the invasion of the Mariana Islands. Each campaign brought different terrain and different tactical challenges, but the pattern remained consistent. Wherever Marines established defensive positions and equipped them with M1917A1 machine guns, Japanese attacks failed with catastrophic casualties. The weapon that had been designed for trench warfare in France proved ideally suited for island warfare in the Pacific. The tactical similarities were obvious in retrospect. Both environments featured fixed defensive lines, sustained enemy attacks against prepared positions, and engagements where firepower sustainability mattered more than mobility. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 provided another dramatic demonstration of the M1917A1's capabilities under extreme conditions. The small coral atoll presented unique challenges. Fresh water was scarce, available only from captured Japanese cisterns, and emergency supplies brought ashore by landing craft. The coral terrain made digging gun pits extremely difficult, forcing Marines to build sandbag emplacements above ground that were more vulnerable to enemy fire. Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination, conducting repeated night attacks against the narrow marine beachhead. Staff Sergeant Norman Hatch commanded an M1917A1 section that held a critical position for 3 consecutive nights, while the Marines expanded their foothold. His guns were resupplied with water from the invasion fleet, sailors filling canteens and jerry cans that were ferried ashore through surf and enemy fire. The guns consumed approximately 2 gallons of water per night, in addition to thousands of rounds of ammunition. But they never stopped firing during enemy attacks, and they never malfunctioned from heat buildup despite the brutal conditions. The Mariana Islands campaign in summer 1944 brought the war significantly closer to the Japanese home islands. The invasions of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in June and July involved larger forces and more intense fighting than previous operations. Japanese defenders knew these islands were considered part of the home territory, and they fought with corresponding desperation. On Saipan, organized Japanese resistance culminated in the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. On July 7th, over 4,000 Japanese soldiers, including wounded men who could barely walk and civilian volunteers armed with improvised weapons, launched themselves at the 27th Infantry Division's lines in a final suicidal assault. The attack hit at dawn, overrunning several American positions through sheer weight of numbers. The defensive line that held was anchored by 4 M1917A1 machine guns, commanded by Sergeant Frank Witek of the 2nd Battalion, 105th Infantry Regiment. Witek's position sat astride the main Japanese avenue of approach, and it absorbed the full fury of the charge. His guns fired continuously for over 2 hours, as wave after wave of attackers threw themselves forward. The cooling jackets were refilled 3 times during the engagement, with Marines crawling to a nearby shell crater filled with brackish water and carrying it back in helmets when canteens ran dry. Ammunition resupply came from the bodies of dead Marines whose positions had been overrun earlier, with runners crawling forward to strip ammunition belts from casualties and carry them back to Witek's guns. By the time the Banzai charge exhausted itself, over 1,600 Japanese lay dead in front of Witek's section. He received a posthumous Medal of Honor after being killed by a Japanese officer with a sword during the final minutes of the engagement. But his guns had stopped the largest massed attack in Pacific War history, preventing a breakthrough that would have endangered the entire American beachhead. The technical evolution of the M1917A1 continued throughout 1944 as ordnance specialists implemented field modifications based on combat experience. Rock Island Arsenal developed an improved water circulation system that increased cooling efficiency by approximately 15%, allowing even higher sustained fire rates without overheating. The new system featured internal baffles that directed water flow more effectively around the barrel's hottest zones. Ammunition feeding mechanisms were strengthened to handle the longer belt lengths that had become standard in Pacific combat, with some positions employing belts of over 1,000 rounds linked together to minimize reloading during critical engagements. New optical sights were developed specifically for the M1917A1, incorporating range estimation features and low-light capabilities that improved accuracy during the night engagements where the weapon saw heaviest use. The doctrine that emerged from these continuous refinements represented a sophisticated understanding of sustained fire tactics. Machine gun sections learned to overlap their fire patterns in ways that created interlocking zones of continuous coverage with no gaps for enemy exploitation. Gunners developed techniques for walking fire across advancing formations, adjusting traverse and elevation to maintain contact with moving targets while conserving ammunition. Ammunition handlers perfected the art of maintaining steady supply to guns during intense combat, using relay systems that kept fresh belts moving forward even when direct routes were cut by enemy action. Water management became a precise science, with experienced crews able to calculate exactly how much cooling water would be needed for planned engagement durations and ensuring adequate supplies were positioned before combat began. By late 1944, as American forces prepared for the invasion of the Philippines and the eventual assault on the Japanese home islands, the M1917A1 had achieved something remarkable for a weapon designed in the first decade of the 20th century. It had not merely survived into modern warfare, but had actually proven superior to newer designs under the specific conditions of Pacific combat. The technical characteristics that seemed like liabilities in peacetime analysis, the weight, the complexity, the water cooling requirement, had revealed themselves as advantages when properly understood and employed. John Browning's genius lay not in creating the lightest or fastest or most technologically advanced machine gun, but in creating one that would continue functioning when everything else failed. In the desperate defensive battles that characterized the Pacific War, that reliability was worth more than any amount of theoretical performance improvement. The island of Peleliu in September 1944 tested the M1917A1 under perhaps the most challenging conditions yet encountered. The Coral Island featured elaborate Japanese defensive networks built into limestone caves and fortified positions that could withstand prolonged bombardment. The Japanese had largely abandoned banzai charge tactics, recognizing their ineffectiveness against American firepower, and instead adopted a strategy of defense in depth that forced Marines to fight for every yard of terrain. This change in enemy tactics reduced the opportunities for the kinds of sustained defensive engagements where the M1917A1 had proven most effective. Yet the weapon remained valuable in its new role. Machine gun crews used the water-cooled guns to provide suppressive fire during assaults on Japanese cave positions, maintaining continuous fire for hours, while infantry worked to close with and destroy fortified emplacements. The ability to fire without pause for cooling prevented Japanese defenders from emerging to counterattack during what would have been thermal-induced gaps with air-cooled weapons. Corporal R.V. Burgin commanded an M1917A1 section during the brutal fighting for Peleliu's ridges, maintaining positions that provided overwatch for advancing rifle companies. His guns fired in sustained support mode rather than defensive mode, a tactical evolution that demonstrated the weapon's versatility. During one particularly intense engagement on September 23rd, Burgin's section maintained continuous suppressive fire for 6 hours and 40 minutes, firing over 18,000 rounds while Marine infantry cleared a series of Japanese cave positions. The water cooling system allowed this extended fire mission without barrel changes or cooling pauses that would have exposed advancing Marines to enemy fire during vulnerable moments. Burgin later calculated that his guns had expended an average of 1 round every 1.3 seconds throughout the entire 6-hour period, a rate of sustained fire that would have been physically impossible with any air-cooled weapon system. The invasion of Iwo Jima in February 1945 represented the culmination of 3 years of Pacific combat experience. The tiny volcanic island, barely 5 miles long and dominated by Mount Suribachi at its southern tip, had been transformed by Japanese engineers into the most heavily fortified position American forces would face during the entire war. Over 20,000 Japanese defenders occupied an elaborate network of tunnels, bunkers, and gun emplacements designed to inflict maximum casualties on the invading Marines. Intelligence estimates predicted the island would fall within 5 days. The battle would last 36 days and become one of the bloodiest in Marine Corps history. Into this crucible came Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, returned to combat duty at his own insistence after over a year spent training new machine gunners stateside. Basilone landed with C Company, 1st Battalion, 27th Marine Regiment, on the morning of February 19th, 1945. The beach was unlike anything encountered in previous campaigns. Black volcanic ash, so fine it had the consistency of powder, covered everything in a layer that made movement exhausting. Each step sank several inches into the loose material, equipment bogged down, vehicles became mired. The ash infiltrated weapons, coating moving parts with an abrasive paste that caused malfunctions in even the most reliable firearms. The M1917, a 1 machine guns that Basilone's section carried ashore, faced immediate challenges. The water jackets accumulated ash that mixed with condensation to form a gritty compound that interfered with heat dissipation. The ammunition belts collected volcanic particles that threatened to jam feeding mechanisms. The ash got into everything, requiring constant cleaning and maintenance under combat conditions where such attention was nearly impossible. Yet despite these environmental challenges, the fundamental advantages of water cooling remained valid. Japanese defensive tactics on Iwo Jima emphasized sudden counterattacks from concealed positions, attempting to disrupt American advances before they could consolidate. These counterattacks, while smaller than the massive banzai charges of earlier campaigns, still required sustained defensive fire to stop. Air-cooled machine guns struggled in the ash-heavy environment, their perforated barrel sleeves clogging with volcanic particles that reduced cooling efficiency even further. Water-cooled guns, with their enclosed jackets, were partially protected from ash infiltration and maintained more consistent performance. Marine armourers developed field-expedient modifications, wrapping water jackets in canvas covers to prevent ash accumulation and adding improvised filters to steam vents to keep volcanic particles out of the cooling system. Basilone's leadership during the first 3 days of the Iwo Jima battle reflected everything he had learned on Guadalcanal and everything he had taught during his year as an instructor. He positioned his machine guns to provide overlapping fields of fire covering the most likely enemy approach routes. He established ammunition and water supply lines that could function even under heavy enemy fire. He personally trained his gunners in the ash environment modifications necessary to keep weapons functioning. He led by example, exposing himself to enemy fire repeatedly while moving between positions to coordinate his section's efforts. On February 21st, the 3rd day of the battle, Basilone was leading his machine gun section toward Motoyama Airfield No. 1 when a Japanese mortar round struck his position. He was killed instantly along with several Marines near him. He was 28 years old. The news of Basilone's death spread rapidly through the Marine Corps, carried by combat correspondents and official dispatches. For many Marines, it felt like losing something more than an individual, no matter how heroic. Basilone had become the living embodiment of machine gun expertise, the symbol of everything the M1917A1 could accomplish in skilled hands. His death on Iwo Jima, fighting with the same type of weapon that had made him famous on Guadalcanal, completed a narrative arc that the Marine Corps would remember for generations. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his actions on Iwo Jima, making him the only enlisted Marine during World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. But perhaps his most important legacy was not his decorations but his contribution to the doctrine that had saved thousands of American lives across the Pacific. The battle for Iwo Jima continued for another month after Basilone's death. M1917, A1 machine guns played their expected role, providing the sustained defensive fire that stopped Japanese counterattacks and the suppressive fire that enabled infantry advances. The volcanic ash environment remained challenging throughout, requiring constant weapon maintenance and improvisation. But the fundamental reliability of water cooling proved itself once again. By the time the island was declared secure in late March 1945, Marine after-action reports documented that M1917, A-1 equipped positions had maintained an average operational readiness rate of 89% despite the harsh conditions, compared to 73% for air-cooled weapons. The weapon designed in 1900 had survived the ultimate test of Pacific combat. The final major campaign of the Pacific War came on Okinawa, beginning in April 1945 and continuing through June. The largest amphibious assault of the Pacific theater involved over 180,000 American troops landing on an island just 350 miles from the Japanese home islands. Japanese defenders implemented their most sophisticated defensive strategy yet, abandoning the beaches and establishing fortified lines across the island's rugged interior terrain. The campaign devolved into grinding attritional warfare reminiscent of World War I, with American forces advancing yard by yard against prepared defensive positions. This tactical evolution actually favored the M1917A1's characteristics. The static nature of the fighting meant weapon weight was irrelevant. The need for sustained fire during Japanese counterattacks played directly to the water-cooled gun's strengths. Staff Sergeant James Day commanded a machine gun platoon during the brutal fighting for Sugarloaf Hill in May 1945, a complex of Japanese fortifications that dominated southern Okinawa. His platoon's M1917A1 guns provided continuous fire support during 14 separate assaults on the position over 8 days. The guns fired in shifts, with crews rotating through positions to maintain 24-hour coverage. Water was obtained from shell craters, bomb craters, and captured Japanese cisterns. Ammunition came forward in a steady stream, with Okinawan civilians employed as bearers when Marine casualties reduced the available manpower. Day's platoon expended over 140,000 rounds during the 8-day battle, an average of over 17,000 rounds per day. The guns functioned throughout, with only minor malfunctions, most related to ash and mud contamination, rather than thermal stress. Day received the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the Sugarloaf battle, and his after-action report became one of the final definitive statements on M1917A1 employment during the Pacific War. By August 1945, when atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the war forced Japanese surrender, the M1917A1 had compiled a combat record unmatched by any other American weapon system. Marines and soldiers who had fought with the guns from Guadalcanal to Okinawa understood that the weapon's sustained fire capability had been decisive in countless engagements. The statistics told a compelling story. Defensive positions equipped with M1917A1 guns achieved enemy casualty rates averaging 3.7 times higher than positions armed with lighter weapons. American casualty rates in M1917A1 defended sectors averaged 38% lower than in sectors defended by air-cooled machine guns. Operational readiness rates for water-cooled weapons averaged 86% throughout the war, compared to 71% for air-cooled variants. These were not marginal differences. They were the difference between success and failure, between life and death, in the desperate defensive battles that characterized Pacific combat. The lessons learned extended far beyond the immediate tactical applications. Military procurement officers who had focused exclusively on theoretical specifications, weight, rate of fire, technological sophistication, learned that battlefield effectiveness depended on factors that laboratory testing could never reveal. Environmental conditions mattered, operational sustainability mattered, reliability under extended combat stress mattered. The newest or most advanced technology was not automatically superior to older designs if those older designs better matched actual combat requirements. This realization would influence American weapons development for decades, leading to more rigorous field testing under realistic conditions before new systems were adopted. The M1917A1 itself remained in service well beyond World War II, seeing combat in Korea and even limited use in the early years of Vietnam. The Korean War proved particularly well suited to the weapon's characteristics. The mountainous terrain and extreme cold of Korean winters created conditions where water cooling could be maintained with snow and ice, and where defensive positions were held for extended periods against Chinese and North Korean mass attacks that resembled the Banzai charges of the Pacific War. The weapon that had stopped Japanese attacks in the jungles of Guadalcanal proved equally effective stopping Chinese human wave assaults in the frozen mountains of Korea. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.